Welcome to Cutting the Fat, a video about improving your writing style. At this level in college, we don't really spend time talking much about grammar. I point things out as I see them, especially if people have grammatical errors over and over. But we do spend some time working with writing style, which is less about something being grammatically correct or incorrect and more about um, knowing how to make stylistic choices that make your writing more concise, more interesting, more engaging, and overall more effective. So three of the tools or techniques I like to introduce students to are the difference between passive and active voice, which some of you may be familiar with, eliminating expletives, and changing nominalization. So most students I know are familiar with the first, but not the other two. I'll go over all three, show some examples, and hopefully you'll leave the video kind of understanding each of these a little bit better. So first of all, passive versus active voice. This is not to be confused with like past tense. It's not a tense issue. It's a voice issue. So passive voice is when the subject of the sentence is not performing the action of the sentence. And here's an example. So the sentence, the book was given to me by Tom. The subject of the sentence is book. The action was given. So you ask yourself, is the book doing the giving? Obviously, the book is not doing the giving. Tom is doing the giving. Well, he's way at the end of the sentence. So consequently, this sentence is in the passive voice. So again, the subject of the sentence, the book, is not actually performing the action. That's what makes it passive. So active, of course, is the opposite, when the subject of the sentence is performing the action. So take that same sentence, put it in the active voice. Tom gave me the book. The subject of this sentence is Tom. The action is gave. Did Tom do the giving? Absolutely. So we know it's an active voice. So the point here is, though, it's not, doesn't mean you always have to write every single sentence in the active voice. It's better to rely much more heavily on writing in the active voice than in the passive voice, because the passive voice, just like it sounds, produces more passive writing. It can often lead to more confusion because who's doing what isn't so clear. And it can just lead to lengthier, less concise, more wordy, and like I said, sometimes more confusing sentences. So though you don't always have to only write in the active voice, a majority of your sentences should be in the active voice. If you have too much in the passive voice, it really weighs your writing down overall. So here's an example. The idea of America as a country of yeoman farmers was embraced by Thomas Jefferson. The subject of the sentence here is idea. The rest of that there's modifying idea. So the subject is idea. The action was embraced. So you ask yourself, is the idea doing the embracing? Absolutely not, right? Thomas Jefferson was doing the embracing. So this is, of course, in the passive voice. One way to try to find the passive voice, it can be hard to learn to recognize these. First of all, of course, you ask yourself, what's the subject? What's the action? Is the subject performing the action? But another way to recognize them is notice the by Thomas Jefferson. Often a passive voice verb is followed by, to be clear. The prepositional phrase by so-and-so or by such and such. That's often how it works because the performer of the action is actually at the end. It's by so-and-so or by such and such. So that can be one way to try to recognize if a sentence is in the passive voice. They can be challenging to learn to recognize, especially in your own writing. But once you recognize them, they're very easy to change, right? We know then you just move the doer, the action to the subject of the sentence. So we can change the sentence very easily. Thomas Jefferson embraced the idea of America as a country of yeoman farmers. So the idea here is they're both grammatically correct sentences. No one could fault you for that. The second one that's in the active voice is a little bit clearer. We're not confused who's doing what. It's also a little bit shorter, more concise. And the verb embraced is more active, more interesting, and it's earlier on in the sentence. That's a way of helping to engage your readers stylistically more often. Eliminating expletives, that's the second one. So sometimes people are not as familiar with that. Or they're familiar with expletives as another word for curse words, which has a different meaning here. Expletives are literal, actual phrases. The phrase there is, or the phrase there are, or the past tense of those, there was, there were. You have to have those words together. Or sometimes, there's always a complication, it is, that phrase can sometimes be an expletive only when the it, in that case, is not functioning as a pronoun replacing another noun. So if I say, I have a car, it is red, that's not an expletive because the word it is actually a pronoun, so it has meaning. The idea here is that these expletive phrases, there is, there are, and sometimes it is, are just meaningless. They're just placeholders, a way of structuring a sentence. They don't actually add meaning to your sentence. If you try to act out there is, or there are, or it is, it'd be tremendously difficult to do that. They're not active, they're not interesting, they don't add meaning. They're just kind of empty placeholders. And the idea here, again, much with passive versus active, is doesn't mean you can't ever have expletives, but if you eliminate more or don't rely on them very heavily, your sentences are often more concise and emphasize more interesting, active, vivid verbs that make your writing more interesting and exciting. So here's an example. There are several prototypes for the artificial heart. We use expletives like this all the time to begin a sentence. You could have a slightly more interesting and more concise sentence if you try to get rid of those expletives and say something like, the artificial heart has several prototypes. Okay, these are simple sentences, but just to kind of show you how this works. Here's another example, this time using the it is. It is obvious. Notice that it is not a pronoun replacing another noun. It's just, it is obvious, meaningless, sentence holder. It is obvious that the American West exerted a profound influence on the photography of Ansel Adams. Versus, if we try to get rid of that expletive, we say something like, there's more than one right way to do that. The American West exerted a profound influence on the photography of Ansel Adams. Again here, the verb in the first sentence is not an interesting, active, engaging verb. The verb in the second sentence is exerted, and it's the fourth word in the sentence. Having more interesting verbs, active verbs, earlier in your sentences is one way to make your writing more interesting, vivid, and exciting for people. Okay, so that's another example. This one is my favorite in an extremely nerdy way, but I feel like it really packs a big punch if you can figure out nominalizations, find them, and work to change them. So a nominalization is in fact a nominalization itself. It's a noun that is also a common verb, or there's essentially a verb in that noun that if you change it back into a verb in the sentence, it often makes the sentence, again, more concise, more engaging, and brings more interesting verbs to the forefront. Examples always help. So in this sense, the acknowledgement of the fact is increasingly widespread that television is a replacement for reading in American culture. So acknowledgement and replacement are nominalizations in this sentence. Notice they're being used as nouns. Those ment, tion, sion, Latinate endings, those are nouns. But notice there are verbs in there, acknowledge and replace. So you could in fact use those as verbs. So here's an example of changing that. With nominalizations, if you recognize them, what you want to try to do is change them back into verb forms. And so we get something like this. People increasingly acknowledge that television has replaced reading in American culture. It's a clearer sentence. It's slightly shorter, so more concise. And the verbs are more interesting. So again, in the first sentence, the acknowledgement of the fact is, our main verb is, again, that boring is. In the second sentence, our main verb is acknowledge. First sentence, we have a second verb, another is after television. When we change replacement to a verb, we've got a much more interesting verb, replaced. Okay. So with nominalizations, the idea is trying to recognize nouns. They don't always have those Latin endings. They're not always really long words like this example, but often they are. And essentially, you're just looking for nouns that have verb forms that you could change into verbs. Other ideas for cutting the fat or making your writing more concise and more engaging is one simple way is to write with more confidence in your position. Whether or not you feel confident, try to channel confidence. Often that forces you or allows you to be much more direct, less wordy, if you're more confident. And then something you probably noticed in all three of those tools I just introduced or examples I gave, the to be form of the verb, that's the is, are, was, were, and be being been. If you remember that from elementary school, those are considered anemic verbs or anemic forms of the verb. They're just weak. And especially if you rely on them a lot, they can really weigh your writing down and make it a lot less interesting. So even just being cognizant of those weak verbs and trying not to rely heavily on those is another way to try to help strengthen your writing. And just remember again, there's a difference between grammar and style. This is style. There's not necessarily right and wrong choices when it comes to sentence style, but better and best choices depending on the situation again. Who are you talking to? Who's your audience? My husband is an engineer and in the sciences, and when I've read through his reports and stuff, he's told me he's supposed to write in the passive voice in a report. He's not supposed to say who does what kind of thing. So obviously there are contexts in which maybe you're asked to or need to write in the passive voice, not the active, or to use nominalizations or expletives. But for the kind of writing I'm asking you to do and the kind of writing I'm encouraging you to practice and get better at, the kind that you could use professionally and or in the public in many different situations, these tools could really help make it stronger because again, the theme here is making it more concise, more active, more engaging, relying on more interesting verbs. So another larger example, here's a paragraph with 4 or 5 sentences. There are many people today with resistance to the idea of year-round schooling. They believe kids would be overworked by the ongoing pressure to learn. With contempt and spite in their hearts, anger is expressed. Those responsible for the evaluation of the parents concerned believe there is plenty of time to address the issue later this summer. Okay, just kind of an average paragraph with average sentences, nothing major wrong in it. But looking for these three, I call them stylistic infelicities, and we'll see what we can do to make the paragraph better. So first, if we go through it and look for passive voice verbs, there's 2 examples of those. Again, that's when the subject of the sentence is not actually, or the subject of that part of the sentence is not performing the action. So we have they believe kids would be overworked by, there's that by, the ongoing pressure to learn. That partially signals that the verb before it might be passive, and indeed it is. Are the kids doing the overworking? No. The ongoing pressure to learn would overwork the kids. And then the second one, with contempt and spite in their hearts, anger is expressed. Who's doing the expressing? Is anger doing it? No. And we don't actually get told here. Is it parents? If we're revising these sentences ourselves, we'd have to make that up. If we're the original author, we'd know who we mean. But there's not even a person or a group of people that would function as the subject here. That's another sign that writing is passive and could be confusing. So is expressed is another passive voice verb. So now if we look for expletives, again, those are usually pretty easy to find. Passive voice can be hard to find, but easy to fix. Expletives can be easy to find because we're looking for specific phrases. So very obviously we've got a there at the beginning and a there is toward the end. And the even more fun one is nominalizations. Okay, so here's 2 nominalizations in this paragraph. Resistance, there's that ance Latinate ending with the verb resist in there. An evaluation, tion ending, that's that Latinate ending with a verb buried in there, evaluate. Okay, so technically in this one short paragraph, there's 2 of each of these stylistic infelicities. Again, having 1 or 2 or 3 of these might be okay, and grammatically it's fine. You would understand what this person's saying, but this paragraph could be more interesting. The sentences could be more engaging if we tried to either address all 6 of these, 2 of each, or at least took on half or 3/4 of these, something like that. Okay, so now here's a look at that exact same paragraph. Now I've just highlighted all 6 of those infelicities. So the blue ones are nominalizations, the yellow are passive voice, and the green are expletives. In class, we would work on revising this together, but in this kind of case, I've already gone through and tried to fix all 6 of those the way I would. Of course, there's more than one way to address all of these. But the idea is you'd try to get rid of the expletives, the ones in green, just literally get rid of them. The blue ones, the nominalizations, you'd try to change from nouns to verbs. Those can be so satisfying. And then the yellow or passive voice, so you try to structure those sentences in the active voice. So here's one example of how you could do that. Many people today resist, so we've gotten rid of the there are. We changed the resistance nominalization into a verb. Many people today resist, oops, I have an error there, but many people today resist the idea, you don't need to anymore, resist the idea of year-round schooling. They believe the ongoing pressure to learn would work kids. So see how I flipped the would be worked, and then the by, telling us what's doing the overworking, I flipped that. So ongoing pressure to learn is the subject now. They believe the ongoing pressure to learn would overwork kids. And then I just tried to combine that sentence with the next one. And I just said, so they express their anger and concerns. I altered the wording a little bit to try to make it a little bit clearer. So eliminating that other passive, anger is express. So I say, so they express, I put the subject first, they express their anger and concerns. And the last sentence, originally, those responsible for the evaluation of the parents concerned believe there's plenty of time to address the issue later this summer, trying to change evaluation to a verb and get rid of the expletive there is. And so I came up with those responsible for evaluating parents' concerns believe they can address this issue later this summer. See how the expletives you can eliminate and not even realize they're gone, those green ones? And see how the blue ones, the nominalizations, can create much more interesting verbs. So some of the main verbs in the original paragraph are, there's that anemic to be verb, believe, would be overworked, is expressed, believe is. And then in the revision, our verbs are resist, believe, overwork, express, evaluating, believe, address. Much more interesting verbs than the anemic forms of to be for sure. You can also tell visually it's a little bit shorter. It's probably one full line shorter basically. So the goal is to be more concise and more engaging and more interesting, keeping your readers interested and engaged in your writing and eliminate any room for confusion. The more passive our writing is, and all 3 of these things contribute to passive writing, the expletives, the nominalizations, and the passive voice. The more passive our writing is, the less engaging it is, the more passive it is, the more confusion there can be. Who's doing what in this sentence, that kind of thing. Okay. So that's an introduction to all 3 of those, or for some, maybe a review of some of those. Feel free to print out the PDF of these slides and kind of go back through and see if you can get a hold of each of these and begin to try to implement them in your own writing.